The letter that would forever change Margaret Taylor's life arrived on a crisp autumn morning in Boston, 1874, bearing news of her future husband's eagerness to meet her in the dusty frontier town of Redemption, Arizona Territory. As the stagecoach wheels churned through the last miles of desert, she clutched that same letter in her gloved hands, wondering if the man who had written such beautiful words would truly be waiting as promised. Margaret stared out the window at the vast, unfamiliar landscape stretching endlessly under the burning sun. At 22, she had left behind everything familiar: her position as a schoolteacher, her small rented room, and the grave of her parents, to marry a man she knew only through months of correspondence. Franklin Osgood had described himself as a prosperous rancher seeking a wife with proper Eastern sensibilities and education. His letters had been eloquent, respectful, and had offered her the one thing Boston could not: a chance to begin anew. The stagecoach lurched to a stop, and Margaret smoothed her travel-worn blue dress, pinning back a loose strand of chestnut hair that had escaped her carefully arranged bun. The driver opened the door, extending a weathered hand to help her down. "Welcome to Redemption, miss," he said, tipping his hat. "Mind your step now." Margaret's boots touched the dusty street, and she surveyed the town with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. Redemption consisted of one main thoroughfare lined with weathered wooden buildings: a general store, a saloon, a small church, and various businesses with faded signs. Nothing like the bustling streets of Boston she had left behind. "Mr. Osgood was supposed to meet me," she said, looking around uncertainly. The driver's face changed, a shadow passing over his features. "Miss, I think you ought to—" His words were cut short by the approach of an older woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a simple dark dress and carried herself with quiet dignity. "You must be Miss Taylor," the woman said, her voice gentle but strained. "I'm Martha Wilson. I run the boarding house. I believe we need to have a conversation." Margaret felt a chill despite the desert heat. "Has something happened to Mr. Osgood?" Martha exchanged glances with the stagecoach driver, who busied himself unloading Margaret's trunk. "Let's get you settled at my place first." The journey must have been exhausting. The boarding house was a two-story wooden structure with a well-kept porch and simple furnishings. Martha led Margaret to a small sitting room and poured her a cup of tea before taking a seat across from her. "Miss Taylor," Martha began, her hands folded in her lap, "I'm afraid I have difficult news. Franklin Osgood is dead." The teacup rattled against its saucer as Margaret's hand trembled. "Dead? But I just received a letter from him 3 weeks ago." "It happened yesterday," Martha explained, her voice softening. "There was a confrontation, a duel with another man. These things still happen out here, though not as often as in years past." Margaret set the cup down, her mind struggling to process the information. "A duel? Over what?" "Land and water rights, primarily," Martha replied. "But there was more to it. Bad blood between families. The man who killed him, Henry Blackwood, his family has had a feud with the Osgoods for nearly a decade. I've traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man who is now dead," Margaret whispered, the reality of her situation sinking in. She had spent nearly all her savings on the journey west. Her teaching position had been filled. There was nothing to return to in Boston. "You're welcome to stay here until you decide what to do," Martha offered kindly. "Perhaps you could find work in town. We're in desperate need of a schoolteacher." Margaret nodded numbly, unable to fully comprehend how her carefully planned future had crumbled in an instant. "When is the funeral?" "Tomorrow afternoon. I'll take you, if you wish to attend." That night, in the small, sparse room at the boarding house, Margaret unpacked her trunk with mechanical movements. Among her possessions was a daguerreotype of Franklin Osgood, a serious-faced man with a neat beard and steady eyes. She studied the image of the stranger she had agreed to marry, wondering what her life might have been. Morning brought no relief to her troubled mind. Margaret dressed in her one black dress, suitable for mourning, and accompanied Martha to the small cemetery on the edge of town. To her surprise, only a handful of people had gathered: Martha, the minister, an elderly ranch hand, and the undertaker. No family, no friends to mourn the passing of Franklin Osgood. As the simple wooden coffin was lowered into the ground, Margaret felt an odd detachment. How could she truly mourn a man she had never met? Yet she had built dreams around his letters, envisioned a life together on his ranch, perhaps even children someday. Now those dreams lay in the grave with him. The minister's words were brief, carried away by the desert wind almost as soon as they were spoken. As the service concluded, Margaret noticed a figure watching from a distance, a tall man on horseback, his face shadowed by his hat. When their eyes met, he turned his horse and rode away. Who was that? Margaret asked Martha as they walked back toward town. Henry Blackwood, Martha replied with a sigh. The man who killed your intended. He came to the funeral of the man he killed? Margaret asked, incredulous. Out here, even enemies show a certain respect for death, Martha explained. Though I'd wager he came more out of guilt than respect. Over the next few days, Margaret tried to adjust to her new reality. Martha helped her secure a position as the town schoolteacher, and she threw herself into preparing the small schoolhouse for the dozen or so children who would become her pupils. The work was a welcome distraction from her uncertain future. A week after her arrival, Margaret was arranging books on the schoolhouse shelves when she heard the door open behind her. Turning, she found herself face to face with the man she had glimpsed at the funeral. Henry Blackwood was taller than she had realized, broad-shouldered with a lean, hard look about him. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with lines at the corners of his blue eyes suggesting he was in his early 30s. He removed his hat as he entered, revealing dark hair streaked with premature gray at the temples. "Miss Taylor," he said, his voice low and graveled. "I heard you've taken the teaching position." Margaret straightened, acutely aware of standing before the man who had killed her intended husband. "Mr. Blackwood, what brings you to the schoolhouse?" He shifted uncomfortably, turning his hat in his hands. "I wanted to offer my condolences. What happened with Osgood was regrettable." "Regrettable?" Margaret repeated, anger suddenly flaring. "You killed the man I traveled across the country to marry, and you call it regrettable?" Henry's jaw tightened. "There's more to the story than you know, Miss Taylor." "Then perhaps you should enlighten me," she challenged, surprising herself with her boldness. "Not today," he said after a pause. "But I also came for another reason. I understand your situation is difficult." Margaret lifted her chin. "I assure you, Mr. Blackwood, I am quite capable of managing my affairs." "I don't doubt that," he replied. "But Osgood's death has left me with a certain obligation. I'd like to make you an offer." "An offer?" she echoed, bewildered. "Of marriage," he said bluntly. Margaret stared at him, certain she had misheard. "I beg your pardon." "It's a practical solution," Henry continued, his expression unreadable. "You came west to be a wife. I took that future from you. I'm offering you another one." "You cannot be serious," Margaret said, finding her voice. "You want me to marry the man who killed my fiancée?" "I didn't say it wasn't complicated," he admitted. "But out here, survival often trumps sentiment. You need security. I need—" He paused, seeming to reconsider his words. "I have a ranch to run and responsibilities that would be easier with a wife." "This is absurd," Margaret said, turning away from him to hide her shock. "I barely know you." "You barely knew Osgood," Henry pointed out. "Yet you were willing to marry him." Margaret spun back to face him. "That was different. We corresponded for months. I knew his character, his hopes. All I know of you is that you're a killer." Henry's expression hardened. "Things aren't always what they seem, Miss Taylor. Especially not in redemption." He placed his hat back on his head. "Think about my offer. It stands for 1 week. After that, I'll assume you've declined." Without waiting for a response, he turned and left the schoolhouse, leaving Margaret staring after him in disbelief. That evening, Margaret recounted the strange encounter to Martha over dinner at the boarding house. "He actually proposed marriage to you?" Martha asked, looking more intrigued than shocked. "If you can call such a cold-blooded proposition a proposal," Margaret replied. "The man has no shame." Martha poured more coffee for both of them. "Henry Blackwood is many things, but I wouldn't call him shameless. His family has been in this valley for 3 generations. They're respected, despite the feud with the Osgoods." "How did the feud begin?" Margaret asked, curiosity getting the better of her indignation. "It started over water rights, like most conflicts out here. The Blackwood Ranch and the Osgood property share a boundary along the Silver Creek. During a drought about 10 years ago, Franklin's father dammed the creek, diverting water from Blackwood land. Crops failed, livestock died. That's terrible, Margaret acknowledged, but surely not worth killing over, especially years later. Martha's expression grew more serious. There's more to it than that. Henry had a younger brother, Matthew. He got into an altercation with Franklin Osgood about 5 years ago. The details are murky, but Matthew ended up dead. Some say Franklin shot him in cold blood. Others say it was self-defense. Margaret sat back, absorbing this new information. So the duel was about revenge? Justice, revenge out here, they often look the same, Martha said with a sigh. I'm not defending what Henry did, but there's always more than one side to a story. That night, Margaret lay awake, her thoughts churning. The man she had planned to marry might have been a murderer himself. The man who had killed him was offering to take his place. The frontier was proving to be far more complicated and dangerous than she had imagined. The next morning, Margaret was surprised to find a leather-bound book on the schoolhouse desk when she arrived. Inside the cover was a simple inscription: "To help you understand redemption. HB." It was a history of the Arizona Territory, focusing on the settlement of the area around redemption. Margaret found herself engrossed in the accounts of pioneering families, including both the Blackwoods and the Osgoods. The book painted a picture of hardship, perseverance, and the complex web of alliances and rivalries that shaped frontier communities. As the week progressed, Margaret threw herself into teaching, finding unexpected joy in the eager faces of her pupils. They were a diverse group, children of ranchers, shopkeepers, and miners, all hungry for knowledge in a place where education was considered a luxury. On her third day of teaching, Margaret noticed a young girl, about 10 years old, lingering after the others had left. "Is something troubling you, Emma?" Margaret asked gently. "Miss Taylor," the girl began hesitantly. "Is it true you were going to marry Mr. Osgood?" Margaret was taken aback by the directness of the question. "Yes, that's true. Why do you ask?" Emma glanced toward the door, as if checking that they were alone. "My pa works for Mr. Blackwood. He says Mr. Osgood wasn't a good man." "Emma, adults sometimes have complicated feelings about each other," Margaret said carefully. "It's not our place to judge." "But Mr. Blackwood is a good man," Emma insisted. "He saved our farm when the bank was going to take it. And he teaches me to ride sometimes." Before Margaret could respond, Emma's older brother appeared at the doorway, calling for her to hurry home. The girl gathered her books and hurried out, leaving Margaret with yet another perspective to consider. As the week drew to a close, Margaret found herself no closer to a decision about Henry Blackwood's proposal. Part of her was outraged at the very suggestion, yet another part recognized the practicality of it. Life as a single woman on the frontier was precarious, and teaching positions were often temporary. On Sunday, Margaret attended services at the small church and was surprised to see Henry Blackwood seated in the back pew. Throughout the sermon, she felt his eyes on her, though whenever she glanced back, he was focused on the minister. After the service, as people gathered outside to socialize, Henry approached her. "Have you considered my offer, Miss Taylor?" he asked without preamble. "I have thought of little else," Margaret admitted, "but I'm afraid I need more time." A flicker of something, perhaps disappointment, crossed his face before his expression returned to its usual stoicism. "Time is something I can give you, but I'd like to show you something first, if you're willing." Curiosity won out over caution. "What did you have in mind?" "My ranch," he said. "If you're to make an informed decision, you should see what life there might be like." Margaret hesitated, glancing around at the churchgoers, many of whom were watching their interaction with poorly disguised interest. "I'll bring Martha along as a chaperone," she said finally. Henry nodded, seeming to have expected this condition. "I'll send a wagon for you both tomorrow morning, if that's agreeable." The Blackwood Ranch lay 10 miles outside of Redemption, nestled in a verdant valley that stood in stark contrast to the surrounding desert. As the wagon approached, Margaret was struck by the beauty of the place, a large, well-maintained house with a wide porch, surrounded by cottonwood trees, with mountains rising in the distance. "It's lovely," Martha commented beside her. "The Blackwoods have always known how to work with the land rather than against it." Henry met them at the entrance, helping each woman down from the wagon. Up close, the house was even more impressive, built of sturdy timber with glass windows, a luxury in the territory. "My grandfather built the original cabin," Henry explained as he led them inside. "My father expanded it, and I've added to it over the years." The interior was surprisingly comfortable, with solid furniture, rugs on the wooden floors, and bookshelves filled with volumes that made Margaret's heart leap. It was not as refined as an Eastern home might be, but it spoke of permanence and care. "Do you live here alone?" Margaret asked, noting the size of the house. "My ranch foreman, Miguel, and his wife Elena live in quarters behind the house. They've been with my family for 20 years. Elena keeps the house, and there are usually 4 or 5 ranch hands staying in the bunkhouse." Henry showed them through the house, including a room he referred to as the library, which contained more books than Margaret had seen since leaving Boston. "My mother was a great reader," he explained, seeing Margaret's surprise. "She taught at a girls' seminary in St. Louis before marrying my father. She made sure education wasn't neglected, even out here." The tour continued outside, where Henry showed them the gardens, the barn, the corrals, and in the distance, the herds of cattle that were the ranch's primary business. "This valley has some of the best grazing land in the territory," he explained. "We've been fortunate, despite the challenges." As they walked, Margaret found herself warming to the vision of life here. It was hard not to appreciate the beauty and bounty of the place, so different from the cramped quarters she had known in Boston. They ate lunch on the porch, a simple but delicious meal prepared by Elena, who Margaret found to be warm and welcoming. Throughout the meal, Henry spoke of his plans for the ranch, his voice animated in a way Margaret hadn't heard before. "You love this land," she observed during a pause in the conversation. "It's in my blood," he acknowledged. 3 generations of Blackwoods have lived and died for this valley." After lunch, Martha claimed fatigue and retreated to rest in the parlor, leaving Margaret and Henry alone on the porch. "Would you like to see the creek?" he asked after a moment of silence. Margaret nodded, curious about the water source that had sparked so much conflict. They walked down a gentle slope to where Silver Creek wound its way through the property. It was a modest waterway, but in the arid landscape, its value was immeasurable. "This is where it began," Henry said, his voice somber. "When Osgood's father diverted the water, it nearly destroyed us. My father had to sell half our cattle just to survive that year." "And that justifies killing?" Margaret asked, unable to keep the edge from her voice. Henry's jaw tightened. "No. Nothing justifies killing. But sometimes it happens anyway. Tell me about your brother," Margaret said suddenly. Martha mentioned he died in a confrontation with Franklin Osgood. Henry was silent for so long that Margaret thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled. "Matthew was 19. Headstrong, idealistic. He believed the feud could be ended through reason. He went to talk to Osgood one night, unarmed." Henry's hands clenched at his sides. "They found his body the next morning by the creek. Shot in the back." Margaret gasped softly. "And Franklin claimed self-defense. He claimed Matthew drew on him first. But my brother never carried a gun, he hated violence." Henry's eyes met hers, pain evident in their depths. "No witnesses. No justice. So you took justice into your own hands," Margaret said, understanding dawning. "I challenged him legally first," Henry explained. "Try to get the sheriff to investigate. But Osgood had influence with the territorial judge. The case was dismissed. And the duel? It wasn't planned," Henry admitted. "We argued in town. Things escalated. He drew first, but..." He trailed off, then added quietly, "I'm faster." They stood in silence beside the creek, the gentle sound of water over stones filling the space between them. "Why did you really ask me to marry you?" Margaret finally asked. "It can't simply be obligation." Henry looked at her directly. "When I heard Osgood had sent for a bride, I pictured someone like him, cold, calculating. Then I saw you at the funeral. You looked lost, but there was strength in you too." He paused. "I respect that, and I think you deserve better than what fate handed you." "That's not a reason to marry," Margaret pointed out. "No," he agreed, "but it's a place to start." As they walked back to the house, Margaret found herself seeing Henry Blackwood in a new light. He was still the man who had killed her intended husband, but the stark lines of villain and victim were blurring. The ride back to town was quiet, each person lost in their own thoughts. As they approached redemption, Martha broke the silence. "He's a good man, beneath it all," she said softly to Margaret. "Hardened by circumstance, but good-hearted." "Even good men can do terrible things," Margaret replied. "True enough, Martha conceded. But out here, we judge people by the whole of their character, not just their worst moments. The following day, as Margaret was dismissing her pupils, she was surprised to see Franklin Osgood's elderly ranch hand, Silas, waiting outside the schoolhouse. "Miss Taylor," he said, removing his worn hat. "Might I have a word?" "Of course, Mr. Jenkins," Margaret replied, curious about what the old man might want. Silas shifted uncomfortably. "I heard tell you visited the Blackwood place yesterday." Margaret nodded, wondering how news traveled so quickly. "There's something you ought to know about Mr. Osgood," Silas continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "He wasn't the man he pretended to be in those letters." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked, her heart beating faster. "He hired a man in St. Louis to write them fancy letters. Franklin could barely read himself, let alone write like that." Silas looked around nervously. "And there's more. He didn't want a wife so much as free labor and someone to control." Margaret felt a chill despite the warm afternoon. "How do you know this?" "I overheard him talking with his friend Peterson the night before. Before the duel, he was laughing about how he'd fooled some Eastern schoolmarm into coming west." Silas twisted his hat in his gnarled hands. "I ain't saying Blackwood was right to kill him, but maybe you had a lucky escape." After Silas left, Margaret sat at her desk, trying to reconcile this new information with the image she had constructed of Franklin Osgood from his letters. Had she traveled across the country based on a complete fabrication? The thought was both terrifying and, strangely, liberating. That evening, a knock at her boarding house door revealed Henry Blackwood, hat in hand. "Miss Taylor," he said formally, "I've come to withdraw my proposal." Margaret blinked in surprise. "I don't understand." "It was presumptuous of me," he continued. "You deserve to make your own choices, not be passed from one man to another like property. That's unexpectedly progressive of you, Mr. Blackwood." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Don't mistake me for an enlightened man, Miss Taylor. I'm still very much a product of this frontier, but I respect you too much to pursue this further." As he turned to leave, Margaret found herself calling after him. "Mr. Blackwood Henry, would you be willing to escort me on a proper outing? Perhaps dinner at the hotel restaurant?" He turned back, surprise evident on his face. "You want to have dinner with me? After everything, I think," Margaret said carefully, "that I would like to know you better before making any decisions about my future." A genuine smile transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him appear younger. "I would be honored, Miss Taylor." "Margaret," she corrected. "If we're to start anew, perhaps we should use our given names." "Margaret," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "Tomorrow evening?" She nodded, and he tipped his hat before departing, his stride noticeably lighter than when he had arrived. Over the next few weeks, Margaret and Henry developed a cautious friendship. They dined together twice a week, took Sunday afternoon rides, and exchanged books they had enjoyed. Margaret learned that beneath Henry's gruff exterior was a thoughtful, well-read man who cared deeply about his community and the land that sustained it. For his part, Henry seemed to delight in Margaret's quick mind and forthright manner. He began bringing her small, thoughtful gifts, wildflowers from his rides, a handcrafted bookmark, once even a small fossil he had found near the creek. "The territorial geologist says this area was once an inland sea," he explained as he handed her the spiraled stone. "Amazing to think of it, isn't it? This desert was once covered in water." "The land remembers," Margaret said, tracing the outline of the ancient creature preserved in stone. "Even when we forget." It was during one of their rides, about a month after their first dinner, that Henry brought up the subject of his original proposal. "I meant what I said about withdrawing it," he clarified as they rested their horses in the shade of a large mesquite tree. "But I find myself hoping that perhaps someday, under different circumstances." Margaret studied his face, noting the vulnerability there that he rarely allowed to show. "Henry, I came west to marry a stranger based on carefully crafted letters. I've since learned those letters were fraudulent, and the man who wrote them was not who I thought. I'm not eager to make another hasty decision." "Of course," he said quickly, looking away. "I understand completely. But," she continued, causing him to look back at her, "I also believe that true character reveals itself over time. And what I've seen of yours gives me hope." The word hung between them, fragile but meaningful. As autumn progressed, Margaret became more integrated into the community of redemption. Her pupils adored her, and she found unexpected fulfillment in teaching children who had never had formal education before. She joined the church's Ladies' Auxiliary, helped organize a harvest festival, and even began a weekly reading circle for adults eager to improve their literacy. Henry, meanwhile, became a more visible presence in town, attending church regularly and participating in community efforts to improve Redemption's infrastructure. Some whispered that his transformation was entirely due to his interest in the schoolteacher, but others noted that he seemed genuinely invested in the town's future. Their relationship developed slowly, with a deliberateness that Margaret appreciated. There were setbacks moments when the shadow of Franklin Osgood and the circumstances of his death threatened to come between them, but they worked through these with honest conversation. "I still have nightmares about it," Henry confessed one evening as they sat on Martha's porch. "Not because I regret defending myself, but because taking a life changes you, no matter the justification. Do you think you'll ever find peace with it?" Margaret asked. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm trying to live a life my brother would have been proud of." Matthew believed in reconciliation, in building rather than destroying. As winter approached, bringing cooler temperatures to the desert, Henry invited Margaret to Christmas dinner at his ranch. She accepted, touched by the formality of his invitation and the obvious care he had taken in planning the occasion. The ranch was transformed for the holiday, with evergreen boughs decorating the mantels, candles glowing in every window, and a small tree adorned with handmade ornaments in the parlor. "Elena has outdone herself," Margaret remarked, admiring the festive touches. "Actually," Henry said, a hint of embarrassment in his voice, "I did most of it myself. My mother always made Christmas special, even during the hardest years." The dinner was magnificent: roast turkey, sweet potatoes, fresh bread, and pies made with preserved summer fruits. Miguel and Elena joined them, along with the ranch hands, creating a warm, family atmosphere that made Margaret's heart ache with a mixture of joy and longing. After the meal, as the others retired to the bunkhouse, Henry led Margaret to the porch, where they stood looking out at the star-filled desert sky. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Margaret unwrapped it carefully to reveal a small leather-bound journal with her initials embossed on the cover. "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers over the soft leather. "I thought you might use it to write your own story," Henry explained. "So much of your journey has been shaped by others' words, the letters that brought you here, the tales you've heard about Osgood and me. Perhaps it's time for your words to take precedence." Margaret was touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift and the insight behind it. "Thank you, Henry. I shall treasure it." "Margaret," he said, his voice suddenly serious, "I know it's only been a few months since you arrived, and that we've had an unconventional beginning, but I find myself thinking of the future, a future with you in it." "Henry," she began, but he gently interrupted. "I'm not proposing again. Not yet. But I wanted you to know that my feelings for you have grown into something I never expected to feel." He took her hand carefully, as if it were made of delicate china. "I believe I'm falling in love with you, Margaret Taylor." The words hung in the crisp winter air between them. Margaret felt her heart racing, emotions tangling inside her: fear, hope, confusion, and something else, something warm and increasingly familiar whenever she was with Henry. "I don't know what to say," she admitted finally. "You don't need to say anything," he assured her. "I just wanted you to know where I stand. The rest is up to you, in your own time." When he escorted her back to town that evening, he kissed her hand with a gentleness that stayed with her long after he had gone. In her room at the boarding house, Margaret opened the journal Henry had given her and began to write, pouring out her complicated feelings about the man who had killed her intended husband and then, against all odds, begun to claim her heart. As winter gave way to spring, Margaret found herself increasingly drawn to Henry and the life he represented. Their outings became more frequent, their conversations deeper. She discovered in him a partner she had never dared hope for, someone who valued her mind as much as her companionship, who encouraged her teaching and respected her independence. It was during an April picnic by Silver Creek, with wildflowers blooming along the banks, that Margaret finally acknowledged what had been growing in her heart. "I believe I'm falling in love with you too, Henry Blackwood," she said, the words both terrifying and liberating. The joy that transformed his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He took her hands in his eyes searching hers. "I never thought I'd find happiness again after Matthew died," he confessed. "I let grief and vengeance consume me. Then you arrived, intended for another man, and somehow became the center of my world." "Life takes unexpected turns," Margaret said softly. "I came west to marry a stranger and found myself mourning a man I never knew. Now I find myself loving the man responsible for his death. It's not the story I imagined writing." "Perhaps that's what makes it real," Henry suggested. "The best stories are rarely those we plan." Their first kiss, beneath the cottonwood trees with Silver Creek murmuring nearby, felt to Margaret like the true beginning of her Western life, not the stagecoach journey, not the funeral of Franklin Osgood, but this moment of choosing love despite the complicated path that had led to it. The following Sunday, as they walked back from church together, Henry asked Margaret the question she had been expecting. "Will you marry me, Margaret? Not out of obligation or practicality, but because I love you and want to build a life with you." This time, the proposal came not from a sense of duty but from genuine affection, and Margaret's answer was equally heartfelt. "Yes, Henry, I will marry you." They were wed in May of 1875, in the small Church of Redemption with the entire town in attendance. Martha Wilson wept openly as she watched Margaret, radiant in a cream-colored dress, exchange vows with Henry, who looked both solemn and joyful in his best suit. After the ceremony, as the community gathered to celebrate, Silas Jenkins approached the couple. "Never thought I'd say this," the old ranch hand admitted, "but I believe Mr. Osgood did you both a favor by bringing Miss Margaret Mrs. Blackwood now out west. Sometimes fate works in strange ways." "Indeed it does, Mr. Jenkins," Margaret agreed, her hand resting comfortably in the crook of Henry's arm. Life at the Blackwood Ranch quickly became everything Margaret had hoped for when she first decided to come west. The house that had impressed her on her first visit became a true home under her care. She continued teaching in town 3 days a week, riding in with Henry or taking the small buggy he had purchased for her use. Their evenings were spent reading by the fire, discussing books and ideas, or planning improvements to the ranch. Henry valued Margaret's opinions on everything from cattle breeding to investments, and she found herself growing more confident in her understanding of ranch operations. "You've brought life back to this place," Miguel told her one morning as they surveyed the vegetable garden she had expanded. "The patron, he smiles now. For many years, there was no smiling in this house." The first anniversary of Franklin Osgood's death passed quietly. Henry and Margaret visited his grave together, placing flowers and standing in contemplative silence. "I'll never be glad of taking his life," Henry said as they turned to leave, "but I cannot regret the chain of events it set in motion. Is it wrong to find blessing in the aftermath of tragedy?" "I don't think so," Margaret replied. "We honor the dead best by living well, not by perpetuating grief and vengeance." In the summer of 1876, as the nation celebrated its centennial, Margaret discovered she was expecting their first child. Henry's reaction, a mixture of joy, wonder, and tender concern, confirmed what she had come to know over their year of marriage. Beneath his weathered exterior beat the heart of a deeply loving man. "A child," he marveled, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "Our child. The next generation of Blackwoods," Margaret said, smiling at his awe. "To love this land as you do." Their son, Matthew Wilson Blackwood, was born on a cold January night in 1877, with Martha Wilson serving as midwife. Named for Henry's lost brother and the woman who had become like a mother to Margaret, the baby brought a new dimension of happiness to the Blackwood Ranch. "He has your eyes," Henry whispered as he held his son for the first time, referring to Margaret's hazel eyes that seemed to shift between green and brown, depending on the light. "And your determination," Margaret added, noting the strong grip of the infant's tiny fingers around Henry's weathered thumb. Life settled into a new rhythm with the baby's arrival. Margaret temporarily set aside her teaching duties to focus on motherhood, though she maintained her reading circle, now held at the ranch once a month. Henry became an attentive father, often carrying little Matthew with him as he attended to ranch business nearby, pointing out cattle and horses to the fascinated infant. As Redemption grew from a dusty frontier outpost to a proper town with a railroad connection, the Blackwood Ranch prospered. Henry's progressive ranching methods and Margaret's educated approach to business matters made them one of the most successful operations in the territory. 3 years after Matthew's birth, their family expanded again with the arrival of a daughter, Elizabeth Martha Blackwood, a spirited child with her father's dark hair and her mother's quick mind. On the children's birth certificates, under father's occupation, Henry proudly listed rancher. But it was another document that truly reflected the transformation in their lives. When Arizona applied for statehood, Henry was selected to serve on the Constitutional Convention, largely due to his reputation for fairness and forward-thinking qualities that had not always been associated with the Blackwood name. "Your brother would be proud," Margaret told him the night before he left for Phoenix. "You've become the man of reconciliation and building that he believed in." Henry smiled, cradling their sleeping daughter while their son played with wooden horses on the floor nearby. "I had an excellent teacher in that regard," he said, his eyes warm as they met hers. "You taught me that the past doesn't have to define the future." "We taught each other," Margaret corrected gently. "The mail-order bride and the gunslinging cowboy who would have thought we'd end up here?" "I knew," Henry said with surprising certainty. "From the moment I saw you at Osgood's funeral, something in me knew that our stories were meant to intertwine." As they sat together on the porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the desert in gold and crimson, Margaret reflected on the strange, winding path that had brought her to this moment. The letters that had lured her west had been fraudulent, the man she had traveled to marry had been a fiction, and the life she had imagined had never materialized. Instead, she had found something far more precious, a true partnership with a man whose rough edges complemented her own, whose strength supported her independence rather than constraining it, and whose love had helped her build a life richer than any she could have envisioned in her Boston schoolroom. "No regrets?" Henry asked, seeming to follow her thoughts as he often did. Margaret looked at their children, at the prosperous ranch around them, at the community they had helped to build, and finally at the man beside her, the unexpected love of her life. "Not a single one," she replied, and meant it with all her heart. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky above their ranch, Margaret thought of the journal Henry had given her that first Christmas, now filled with her careful script documenting their journey together. It was a story she could never have imagined when she first stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption, a story of loss and discovery, of judgment and forgiveness, of a mail-order bride who found her true destiny in the arms of a man she had every reason to hate. It was not the story she had come west to live, but it was infinitely better than the one she had planned. And as Henry's arm wrapped around her shoulders, pulling her close in the gathering dusk, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that their story, unexpected, complicated, and beautiful, was still just beginning.